Today's 1 hour program is sponsored by the George Washington University Law School Animal Law Program and Three Pearls Charities. I'm your moderator, Jamie McLaughlin. This webinar aims to provide valuable insights into the changing legal and legislative landscape, focusing on how these changes could impact the work of animal lawyers. The discussion will pinpoint potential problems and discuss tactical strategies for dealing with legal and political roadblocks, providing attorneys and advocates with tools to move forward and inspiration for novel ways to make positive changes for humans, animals, and our shared environment. Our inaugural session features Kathy Hessler, Assistant Dean of the Animal Law Program at the George Washington University Law School and Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative. Today, Kathy will recap actions taken by the 2016 Trump administration and will highlight some recent actions of the current administration to consider what might be coming next. Kathy's presentation will be followed by informal breakout rooms where participants can share concerns and brainstorm about potential collaborations. Some questions will be posted for you in the chat. Please copy or save these prompts to use during your breakout sessions. After the breakouts, we will meet again as a group and participants will be invited to share some takeaways discussed in their breakout rooms. The presentation portion of this webinar will be recorded. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. Please mute yourself until the breakout rooms. I'd like to give a special thanks to Yingzi Dai, Program Associate of GW Law Animal Law, for running our webinar today. And no CLE credit is available for today's program. Now, please welcome our speaker, Kathy Hessler. Kathy is the inaugural Assistant Dean for Animal Law and Founding Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at the George Washington University Law School and affiliate faculty for the Global Food Institute. Dean Hessler has been a clinical law professor for over 30 years and has been teaching animal law since 2000. She is the first law professor in the world hired to teach animal law full-time. Dean Hessler helped develop the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, directed the Animal Law Clinic, created and directed the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, and co-founded World Aquatic Animal Day. At GW Law, she created the Aquatic Animal Law Project, the Animal Law and Science Project, the Council on Animal Legal Education, and the Coolidge High School Project. Dean Hessler also writes and lectures widely. Thank you for joining us, Kathy, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Pull up my slides. We know that there's an awful lot going on right now, so I appreciate everyone being here. I'm going to give something of an overview and then the idea that we'll tee up some conversation so that we can talk sort of amongst ourselves and in a group about where we go from here. So I do want to start with thinking about the election results, the current status and sort of the evolving status of the U.S. government and sort of where it's heading and sort of our democracy in general terms, and then how that affects our thinking about work for animals in this context. And maybe we can be addressing within that question that many of us often receive, which is why work for animal issues when there's so many other important things generally, but even more particularly in these challenging times, why should people care about these issues? So we can talk about why that's important. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening now and sort of fortifying ourselves for the challenges to come. So the framework that I want to share is for this conversation is that we're learning how to respond to changes under the Trump administration. So the last Trump administration was a little bit different than what we had, in some respects, than we had been used to in terms of Democratic and Republican administration. And the new Trump administration is designed, right? The goal of the new administration is to very much fundamentally change how government functions, federal government in particular, but government in general, and the relationship between the government and private business and individuals and states and so forth. So thinking about how to respond to that explicitly is going to be critical in the work that we do. And the broad ranging nature of the actions that this new administration is taking and wants to take is going to have a huge impact on our work, right? Business, trade, economics, research, medicine, food systems, financing, education, right? Pretty much everything. So many facets of our work lives and our personal lives are going to be affected by this. So thinking about how to receive what's going on and sort of respond to it in our interest. And it's useful to know that this is occurring in a time and space where the political changes around the globe have affected animal work. And so this is not just happening in the United States, but I am going to focus on what's going on in the United States primarily. And it's not just the presidential election, but changes at the U.S. court, changes in our democratic structures, reduced resources for welfare and protection initiatives for people, for animals, and for the planet is our sort of new normal going forward. At the same time, there's increased need for welfare and protection on behalf of all of these needs. So what are sort of the overall categories of concerns that we're thinking about? We're looking at weakened regulatory systems, because the incoming administration has as one of its goals to the deregulation, right, of the federal government in general and the state government. So there's already in place a system in our regulatory system that's supportive of industry goals, right? So there's a lot of industry capture, there's a lot of working together hand in hand, right? The regulatory systems, the agencies with the regulated industries. So that's already the system that we're working with and struggling against sometimes. There's less funding and support for the agencies to do the work that we think is important. And right now we're having less and less independence for those agencies to do that work, both because of Supreme Court decision making and because of the new decisions of the incoming of the new Trump administration. So we have a weakened regulatory system that's at least theoretically designed to protect animals, the environment, and people. And so its ability to do that work, if that's what we think the goal is, what I think the goal is, it has less ability to do that. We have a more highly politicized and divided judiciary. So the judiciary system is seen as less independent right now. They're at the Supreme Court level. We don't have a clear, consistent sort of judicial philosophy. That it continues to evolve. They're upsetting precedents and starting crises. So we have a lot of evolving approaches, both strategically when thinking about cases that might go to the Supreme Court, as well as predicting how the Supreme Court might be deciding. So that makes it more difficult to develop successful legal strategies. And again, this body seems to be much more deferential to powers of the president than in previous history. And we have ineffective legislatures, right? So they're in some states very divided. They're more embattled, and again, being more deferential to the president. I think there was an act just passed in the Florida legislature called the Trump Act, right? So even state legislatures are trying to be seen as or currying favor with the president. So we've increased presidential power with these structural problems increasing, and this is true, not just in the U.S. So animals, those are sort of global role of law, role of democracy kinds of issues. And then we have some animal-specific concerns with the incoming administration. So those relate to, again, really broad range of topics: food systems, research alternatives and support for them, protection of endangered species, habitat protection, controls on pollution. We're seeing increased fossil fuel use and development in terms of drilling and mining and developing, increased fishing, aquaculture, and farming, damage to ocean and land, and the border wall is going to have an impact on ecosystems. So, and those are all things the current administration is trying to ramp up. So when we look back at what happened in President Trump's previous administration with respect to animal issues, we can see some of the impact that they had, the administration had. Excuse me, I have a bit of cold, so apologies. So his advisors in the last administration had connections to animal use industry. And those advisors were either in a sort of more peripheral advisory role, but they also headed up agency staff departments. So that meant that there was more focus on or support for trophy hunting, puppy mills, factory farming, horse slaughter. And President Trump personally denounced the Ringling Brothers Circus choice to phase out elephants and said he would not go anymore after they did that. He called for the FDA to stop regulating pet food, The administration delisted some endangered animals. They didn't enforce animal law protection laws and regulations. They allowed more self-policing within industries, for instance, in the factory farming context. They reduced transparency in terms of not being responsive to FOIA requests, the data purge on the USDA website, lack of reporting, and so on. Allowed more trophy hunting permits and importation of trophies, overturned bans on controversial killing methods like baiting, killing animals in their dens, killing with their young. We repealed the organic farming rule, denied petitions that placed the cables as sources of pollution in the Clean Air Act, unlawfully withdrew the Soaring Act, made it harder to consider climate change when considering whether to protect species, killed the rule or requiring organic farmers to meet certain animal welfare standards, which was outdoor access, slaughter lions, fees, bad for workers and animals, gutted protections for migratory birds, declined the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act significantly. So some of these things, happened in really large numbers. So the inspections fell by 67%, and new investigations in 90%. The general climate denial, opening up the National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska to oil and gas development, and allowed the largest expansion of hunting and fishing opportunities in U.S. history. So that's a lot, right? To be fair, right, it wasn't all bad under the Trump administration, the previous one. So there were some improvements for animals that were used in research, some protections for wild horses and burros initially, and then backtracking from that. Agencies did reduce breed discrimination of companion animals. That was good. The president signed the PACT Act. Congress authorized the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act, and as part of an omnibus bill, and the president signed that. Animal fighting in U.S. territories was outlawed. Some protections for certain marine animals, mammals, were increased, and NIH made some retirement-eligible animal research available for adoption. So those are all good things, right? And I want to be clear that some of the bad things and some of the good things we can say were directly because of President Trump, because those were his initiatives or his interests, and some came from the administration. Right? So not all things that happen in an administration you can blame the president for take credit for as the president. Okay, so past is prologue, right? What can we learn from the past, and how can we go forward with that information? So there seems to be this theme of sort of cruelty, actual cruelty, people wanting bad things to happen to people or animals, or things that they don't care about, people they don't care about with whom they disagree. Chaos is an actual end goal for this administration because they want to destroy some of the systems that they think are bad, right? Whether we call that the deep state or something else, or woke ideology. So destruction of an overwhelming, sort of meaning too much going on to support norms, laws, and constraints, right? These things are the goals. So to break down what they think of as this sort of post-liberal, whatever order that they don't like, right? So they have this explicit ideology that says these things are bad and we need to stop them. This is sort of the full court press, if you will, about how we're going to. And last time, a lot of people said that they voted for President Trump, despite his behavior, despite the cruelty, the craftiness, the immorality, those kinds of things, because of the policy goals. So despite that, they voted for him. But this time, according to some of the surveys, a lot of people actually are voting for this behavior, for this approach.
Kathy?
So that seems, yeah.
Some people are saying they can't hear you well.
Oh,
yeah, it's sounding a little bit garbled. I'm sorry. I know it's partially because you're not feeling 100%, but maybe it
might
is.
Be the phones.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can try something else with audio. So thanks for letting me know.
Okay. So I changed that. Is that helping?
Yeah.
Better? Oh, good. Okay. I think the audio just defaulted incorrectly. Okay. Thank you for letting me know, and let me know if we need to do that again. Okay. So thinking post-election, again, presidents aren't responsible for everything, the good and the bad. There are other actors, but our current president is a very sort of centrally, powerfully focused person, right? So he wants all of the things that are happening in his administration to support and reflect the goals that he has for this administration. And who he represents, who he appoints is going to reflect that. And that's even more true this administration than the last time. So that we have that sort of reality, and then we have these systems that need to be fortified in our sort of democracy and our justice system, respect for science, those kinds of things. And that's not the direction that this administration is interested in going. So we're going to have to see how those things kind of work together. So along with animal issues, we have a lot of other issues that we need to be thinking about that are sort of structural issues with how we operate. We operate within the system, within the legal system, within the sort of media ecosphere and those kinds of things. So there are other things that we need to be thinking about. I'm focused mostly on the legal system that are going to end up affecting how we do our work. So voter suppression laws, redistricting, filibuster in Congress, efforts to either pass constitutional amendments or change or ignore current constitutional interpretations, this general deregulation, dismantling of agencies and oversight, firing federal workers, dismantling DEI and protections for vulnerable communities, having benefits run directly to corporations, judicial appointments that are politically focused, challenging norms and laws, and challenges with international relations. So these are other things sort of in the background that we're going to need to be thinking about. Okay. So what's been happening now? So that's sort of the framework for where we are now. We're a week and a half into the term. The president has issued 78 presidential actions. I can tell you, as I was preparing this, I kept having to update this slide over and over, just hour by hour. So how to think about this, I put these actions of the president into a couple of different categories that are overlapping and intersectional, but just to help us kind of put them in some categories. So sort of substantive actions, procedural actions, and things that have an emotional impact on us that are also going to be substantive or procedural. And then I'm not going to talk about it a ton, but we have these collateral concerns too, right? The private corporation responses, media responses, and this pre-capitulation that I will talk about a little bit more. Okay, so some of the substantive actions. So the president has already withdrawn the US from the Paris Climate Accord and the WHO. So these are not surprises. This happened last time. There's a process for each, and we'll see how that goes. He has said that he wants to put people over fish and stop radical environmentalism from providing water so that water can go to people in Southern California rather than fish. What this is responding to is the protection of endangered species in California, and he's connecting that to the crisis in LA, which those things aren't connected. He talked about unleashing American energy, stopping offshore wind leasing, putting America first in international environmental agreements, ending all DEI programs, funding, staffing. Many of those staff members have already been laid off, and programs have ended. And that's across the board, right? Smithsonian's already ending their programs. Schools, colleges, obviously other government agencies. So expanding oil and gas drilling, mining and logging, which is going to have devastating impacts on animals. He's already reversed the commitment to conserve 30% of US land and water by 2030, reversed the ban on offshore oil and gas drilling in the waters across the country, reopened Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas leasing, repealed the protections for the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. And all of this is moving us sort of in the wrong direction in terms of protecting wildlife, right? So given that we've had a 73% decline in wildlife population since 1970, we're reaching significant crisis status for wildlife in the US. The president has also declared a national energy emergency to allow more energy production and exploration on federal land, despite the fact that the US is producing more oil than any country ever has. Okay, so what does this end up meaning? So just as an example of the impact of some of these executive actions, this allows for bypassing environmental regulations, public notice, expert input, right? It allows agencies to move forward much more quickly without those kinds of regulatory procedures. And it means that agencies won't be able to protect animals and the environment in the way that they traditionally do or have. They've also sort of reinvigorated what's referred to as the God Squad. This is a committee that has only met 4 times in the last 50 years for, under the ESA, and now, or sorry, 6 times, but now they're going to be mandated to meet 4 times a year. This is a committee that has the authority to exempt the EPA from, from actually all federal agencies, from ESA protections endangered species sort of mandates, even when they know doing so will result in extinction of a species. That's why they're called the God Squad. So they basically get to decide to let a species go extinct for economic or other reasons. Okay. Also, we're worried about the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty, Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, trophy hunting, sort of other kinds of things that are coming down the pike. It's not clear where this administration will go in terms of animal testing. There's already a reduction in research. Because there's a pause on grants, there's a pause on hiring, there's a pause on even reviewing the grants that are in like NIH pipeline. These things aren't being done to protect animals or to protect science or to improve science, and will in fact undermine faith in science, which is not helpful. They could result in the worsening of protections for animals in labs, but there may also result in the reduction of research of animals on animals in labs. So we're going to have to see how that kind of shakes out. The white coat waste folks worked with the Trump administration last time, and it has worked with the Biden administration, and it has worked to shut down some labs in a really bipartisan kind of way. So we'll see if that strategy continues to be productive. Okay. So in looking at the 78 executive actions, I was looking for something I could say was good or not awful. And I found that the president granted federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. It's not to do with animals per se, and I think that was a good thing. Even though ICE agents around the country are arresting Native Americans in their immigration raids and refusing to accept tribal documentation as proof of citizenship, so that's not good. And maybe the declassifying records concerning the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK, we can say is a good thing. Depends, I guess, on how you feel about that. For some, I think the TikTok reprieve was a good thing. And I don't know what else, right? So you guys can look at the stuff that's done. Those were really the things I saw that I thought could be considered good things. Procedurally, so there's a lot going on here as well, right? So the federal government has now a hiring freeze, and they're reclassifying and firing federal workers. I can tell you, as a law professor at GW, our students have lost jobs already that they were promised for the summer, lost permanent jobs. Their interviewing processes have stopped. So there's just already widespread repercussions from this hiring freeze. The federal government has also told the FDA and other agencies to silence all external communications, and they don't even know how to interpret that. So they're canceling conferences. They're not even communicating with vendors in things like buying computers. And obviously, substantively, it makes the work much, much more difficult trying to figure out how to talk about bird flu, for instance, that's ascendant. How do we do that when they're not allowed to talk externally to the agency? Inspector generals are being fired. The administration is changing course on regulations, cases, and settlements. And obviously, some of this stuff happens with any changeover in administration, but often there's a longer process. There's sort of a ramp up, right, where people have time to sort of adjust to some of these things, and it's not done all at once, and it's also not done as across the board as some of these things are happening. There are investigations for people who have been involved in investigating. As we know, a sort of political retribution. This administration is rejecting the idea of bureaucratic independence, meaning that they don't believe that Congress and agencies should be independent from the president in the way that we have thought of. They have this unitary executive theory that the president controls everything, certainly within the executive branch. They believe in this concept called impoundment that says that the president has the authority to take back funding that has been appropriated by Congress, even though that's against the law that was passed in 1974 post-Watergate. They're saying that law is unconstitutional, so they can ignore it. We have a freeze on grant proposals, decisions, and reviews across the federal government. There's a requirement now that people snitch on their colleagues or face consequences when those colleagues are not following what people think they ought to be doing in terms of adhering to the goals that the Trump administration is trying to achieve. using the power of the deep state against Trump's enemies, or eliminating it entirely, plans to dismantle NOAA, maybe FEMA, other Department of Education. They've already working to unprotect, to take away protection for national monuments, land national monuments, not like literal monuments, protecting endangered species. And NOAA withdrew the proposed rule to protect white whales from vessel strikes, thinking about increasing shipping space. There's just so much going on. Sorry, I'm just going to go through a bunch more stuff and then we can talk. So much of the USAID leadership is on leave for trying to circumvent Trump's aid freeze, right? So they're saying you weren't working with us and so you're now on leave. And so the remaining workers have been silenced and the people receiving USAID help have been threatened not to say anything about what's going on or not going on. So I want to talk really, really quickly about one case study. And apologies again for my cold. So on Monday, President Trump issued an executive order freezing grants and loans from the federal government that dealt with potentially $3 trillion. Okay, so people started freaking out and saying, like, what does this affect? Seems to affect everybody. Does it affect everybody or everything? Social Security and Medicare were particularly specifically exempted, but Medicaid wasn't. That affects 82 million people. Other things that were included: disaster relief, school funding, child and elder care programs, public safety, environmental programs. Small business and farmers were exempt, but not school lunch and breakfast programs. Rental assistance should have been exempt, but it wasn't. Shelters, roads, bridges, adoption service. In DC alone, right, gets $187 million for its health department doing AIDS, HIV, disease prevention, nutrition work, right? So people were freaking out. Systems were literally not working on Tuesday. So that executive order was signed Monday night. By Tuesday morning, people were already not able to access some of their funding, some of the people in the agencies, whoever they needed to do their work. That sparked an outcry and a lawsuit. And so by Tuesday afternoon, there was already an order where a court paused this freeze until February 3rd. And today that freeze was rescinded, at least temporarily. So we'll see what ends up happening with that. But that's just one example of sort of major upheaval. Nobody seemed to know what was going on, even within the administration, about how broad this order was and what it affected. So there's a lot also going on sort of around this work. So this idea that has emotional impact that adds layers onto the challenges that we're facing with our substantive work. So this idea of going after political enemies with federal power and saying that explicitly is a new thing, right? Or at least relatively recently new thing in the United States, going after people who dissent and eliminating dissent, not just within the ranks of federal government employees. We're supposed to have whistleblower protection, right? That people are supposed to have the ability to feel whatever it is they think and feel and not have to sort of do the bidding, right, of a political one political sort of viewpoint, right? People are supposed to have jobs and they're supposed to do their job to the best of their ability, sort of without regard to politics. But that's not happening right now, or not allowed to be happening right now. There's government freeing violent offenders, targeting DEI stuff. And so again, just one example of the DEI stuff. So the Air Force felt they needed to remove videos of the Tuskegee Airmen from their training and information about women in the Air Force, because that would be seen as DEI, even though it's like fact and reality. That has been reversed. And people said they were maliciously complying with the order. So we're in sort of an Alice in Wonderland place now. So we have censorship, we have a consolidation of power, we have violence and threats to judicial and government officials, more than we ever have before. So this is a new example of the performance of power. It's a different kind of performance of power than we have had in the United States, where working for or with or on behalf of others who are vulnerable is seen as weakness, and that's bad. And that protecting others is seen at a cost to the status quo, whether that's white males or however people are sort of construing that status quo. And this working to getting back to male supremacy or Christian nationalist sort of supremacy, right? These are articulated goals of some of the folks who are running the Trump administration. So there's a professor at Dartmouth whose quote I thought was really helpful that that the president is using these tools of government to challenge the limits of a post-Watergate presidency. So there's this articulation of this sort of neoconservative or what have you view of federal government. And so that's one thing. But what she also said, or what he also said, sorry, is that some of these efforts will be turned back by courts, but the level of anticipatory obedience we're seeing from businesses, universities, and the media is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime. And so that's something I think we can talk about. People are caving in even before these orders are coming into effect or have been challenged and deemed to be legal. So that's something to be thinking about. So there's calls for people who disagree with the president to be deported, or worse, really violent calls for retribution against people, freezing international aid, even to petty things like the photos of aid workers helping people have already been taken off the walls at the agency, which I don't think has ever happened before. We have immigration raids now authorized at churches and schools and hospitals. We have sort of this cruelty, revenge, and retribution values, right, are now part of our federal government and guiding principles for action. And they're continuing to use lies and false information as premises for their actions. Obviously, there's international concerns that we have, in addition to withdrawing from or refusing to ratify treaties and lack of or poor international engagement. We have significant issues. We're worried about endangered species management across borders. We're worried about border crossings, animals in war-torn habitats, things like deep sea mining, overfishing, ship strikes. Those things are going to be really important in our community. Okay, how are people reacting? People are reacting in all kinds of ways, but within the sort of legal community, there have already been lawsuits filed against many of these actions. The attempts to change the birthright citizenship has already been blocked right now. Environmental lawsuits were filed on the first day and will continue to be filed. And the suit to challenge the freeze on funding was successful, at least, again, for the time being. So we'll see what happens. But businesses and nonprofits are looking at their exposure, looking at their risk, trying to do their work and trying to figure out how to manage this risk and respond. And educational institutions and others are doing the same thing. So important goals. We want to maintain access to the courts and keep courts functioning appropriately, working with state legislatures, maintaining independence of the state legislatures would be good, engaging public and experts, enforcing the laws we have. We're going to have to be really creative in using the laws to address animal issues. We always have been creative, and we're going to have to continue to be creative. We're going to have to develop strategies that are flexible and not just based in the legal system, but understanding and appropriately using other domains, which again is something we've been getting much better at: science, economics, public health, and so forth. All right, so how do we proceed given all of that? So take a deep breath. That was a lot. And so processing that, I know, is also a lot. So how do we move forward? So my reminders for you are: be good to yourself, be good to others, be patient with yourself and others. We maintain respectful and professional actions, get support where you need it, give support where you can, prepare for these challenges. It's going to be a long road, right? People often say a marathon, not a sprint, right? We're definitely in that kind of space. It's useful, I think, to have short-term plans, like how do we get through the next week? How do we get through the next month? How do we get through the next year? What are our strategies? What are our plans? So short-term and long-term planning is important. Strengthening our networks and working with advocates, both within and outside the animal movement, will be important. So things have been bad in the US before. There's also a history of resistance, and people define bad differently, right? So what I might think is bad, other people might think is good. But there's a history of working to protect people and the planet and animals and democratic ideals, right? And that will continue. Adversity is something that can strengthen and organize us in our work. It can help us give focus. We've seen a lot of significant progress, and so there's a lot to protect and a lot more to do. And we can keep perspective and realize that other folks have it much more difficult, much worse in other places around the world. Doesn't mean it's not bad here or getting worse or challenging or concerning. So what happens now? Well, so a lot of people are scared. Some people are disappointed. Some people are angry, but we have work to do. So positive things are happening. We are part of that. Animal issues is something that can unite people. it's useful to savor good news when we have it. It's good to remember there are a lot of good people in the world, right? Everywhere. And there's a lot of good work continuing. There's new things starting, and we want to work to be part of solutions, right? So we're not giving up, we're not giving in. And so thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We're going to take a minute and split into breakout rooms right now. We have some question prompts, but you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in the breakout rooms. Again, the recording is going to stop now before we go into the breakout rooms so that we're not recording those sessions for privacy purposes. And once we are concluding the breakout rooms, we're going to come back and meet again. And if you feel comfortable sharing something that you talked about or had an epiphany that you want to share with everybody, we'll have a little discussion, and then